Hello, my name is Vanessa Lesniak from the Pigeon Letters design team. Welcome to this month's tutorial. So, I have been experimenting lately with using my watercolors on different surfaces. And one of the best surfaces I found beside watercolor paper is canvas. So I wanted to do a demonstration and a little tutorial on using watercolor on canvas. So I bought this pack of 24 mini canvases, and these are 4 by 6. And one of the I've tried different canvases. One of the things, and well, I've tried different canvases, and I'm going to give you a few pointers on finding the best ones. So I just purchased these off of Amazon. They're no particular, brand or anything. It's just plain old watercolor canvas. So, a couple of things that you should look out for when you are purchasing your canvas. One, make sure that it is 100% cotton canvas. So, this one is 100% cotton and it is 300 GSM. This one says that it is suitable for oil and acrylic painting. Some of them may say watercolor painting as well, but here's the little trick. The ones that say specifically made for watercolor painting are typically way more expensive than the ones that don't say it. So all you have to look out for is that it says 100% cotton, that it is also primed. So it can be primed with or without gesso. This one does not have gesso on it. You can also prime it yourself. Mine is not primed with gesso. The other thing that you want to look out for is to make sure that it is of archival quality. So it's acid free and the canvas won't yellow after a while. I haven't seen many that are not archival quality, but just something to look out for. So we're going to take all these canvases and put them away and grab one. Now, painting on canvas with watercolor is fairly easy once you get the hang of it. So, you're going to notice that one, the canvas doesn't get as wet as the 100% cotton paper. Also, the canvas dries quicker, so you kind of have to account for that. Now, there are two ways you can do it. I'm going to demonstrate one way. The first way is you can wet the entire canvas as you would with regular watercolor paper and then use wet on wet techniques. The wet on wet techniques don't work as well on canvas because the paint doesn't flow. So it doesn't flow as well. So you'll have to tip the canvas, which gives it absolutely beautiful effects. Don't get me wrong, I am all for that. But today's technique, we're going to start with a wet on dry and then move to a wet on wet. So today we're going to be painting a little mini galaxy, your very basic starter galaxy. So I am going to bring out my paints, and my paints are from the Sprout Creative, and I'm going to do a neutral toned galaxy. So it's going to be very soft and not too bright, and it's just going to be a nice and neutral galaxy. So let's make this the centerpiece here. And I am going to start off with, I'm going to be using a size 10 round Pigeon Letter Studio brush. Okay, so we're going to work from light to dark, and my lightest color is going to be this one. It's called Chesapeake Gray. It looks pretty dark in the pan, but it isn't. It's a nice light gray bluish color. And I am going to start painting directly on the canvas. And you'll see here, a lot of the paint stays where you put it. So it's not like watercolor paper where you add the paint and it will flow in. There's a little tiny bit of flow, but not too much on the areas that it's wet. So this is going to be a nice, simple galaxy. So what I'm doing is I'm wetting my brush and then putting it in the pan of paint, adding it. Then let me bring my water here so that you'll be able to see it. I'm just taking my water and just adding a bit more water to pull some of that paint out. And we're going to continue. I'm going to continue adding some paint and then some plain water. And you're going to see here that it is not even. So we're going to have little splotches of color here and there, and that's the look that we're going for. We're going for a nice, uneven, sort of splotchy look. So I'm adding a little bit of paint, and then I am adding in a little bit of water. We want this to be irregular and uneven, which is why we are adding it in sporadically. It also helps if you have a paper towel by you. That way, if you have too much water on your brush, you can clean it off. And you're going to notice that the water on the canvas sits right on top of the canvas. It doesn't sink in, it sits on top, so you can manipulate the paint by tilting your canvas and pushing it to the side, push it up, push it down. You can do quite a bit of things with it because the water doesn't really sink into the canvas, it just sits on top. So we're going to use that to our advantage by plopping in some more color into your canvas. And I am really loading my brush up so that I can get a little darker. So for the first layer, it was nice, a nice light layer. And now I am putting in a much darker layer, and it's going to be a little bit splotchy, right? We just tap it in. We don't want to um, we don't want to brush it in like this because you're going to see a lot of your brush strokes. So you want to just tap it in. If your canvas begins to dry, just add water around the edges of where you added the paint. And then we are going to use, again, we're going to use the wet canvas to our advantage. So now I am going to take my paper towel and I am going to put it on my desk just to protect my desk. And we're going to tilt. We're going to tilt a bit and just let some of that paint just streak on the canvas. And we don't want it to blend too much, so we're not moving it around too much. Another thing you're going to see with the canvas is that the canvas wraps around the edges of the cardboard. So you want to make sure to get in there with just some plain water and wet the edges. That way the paint is able to slip off the sides of the paper or of the canvas. So let the paint slip off the sides by wetting the outside, the edges, and then we are going to go back in with a third layer. And again, we are just going to plop. We're going to plop some paint here and there on the canvas. There is like no rhyme or reason. I am just plopping some paint in. Now, once I've done that, I am going to move on to a darker color. I'm going to allow this to dry for just a little tiny bit. You don't want it to dry too much because we're going to be working now wet on wet. And we're using the wet canvas to our advantage. You'll see just how wet this canvas can get. And all of that water sits on the top layer. You can move it around, right? And now we're going to get a little bit of a darker color. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to go in with a little bit of indigo. And I'm going to move to a smaller brush. And this is a Pigeon Letters size 6 studio brush. And I am going to go in with a darker color along the edges of the canvas. And again, I am doing that same thing. I'm just kind of like plopping it in. Make sure you have something down to protect your desk. And I'm mostly putting this along the edges. I like to have my galaxies nice and dark along the edges. Again, you don't have to use super dark colors. And if you do use them, you can use them very sparingly. Let's add some water to water this down. And you'll see that I'm putting it on the four corners here, just to kind of darken those up a little bit. We'll add some here. If you're so inclined, add some to the edges, but if they are not completely going to the edges, that's okay. We will worry about that a little bit later. So you'll see here that I'm just adding some to the edges. And then another thing that I love to do to kind of bring out the depth in a galaxy is to add some to the middle very, very, very sporadically. Just a couple of spots here and there. You don't want to get too crazy, just a few spots here and there to bring in some depth to your piece. So I'm going to leave it like that. Set this aside, and I'm going to just move it around just a bit to get rid of those really hard edges. And again, we're just tilting it. If you have a paper towel underneath it, do as I'm doing and lift up the whole paper towel. That way you won't get, your hands all dirty, which happens all the time. If there are any portions that are stark white, just fill those in. And then we are done with the indigo. Now, I like to add a little contrast in with the colors. But since I'm keeping this piece really light, I'm going to go in with a super light purplish gray color. And this one is called Dreams. So I'm going to take this really light purple gray color. Again, it's very, very light. And I'm going to just add a little bit of it. It's going to mix in nicely with that blue. And just to give this piece a little tiny bit of interest. And it's not going to be very different from the colors underneath. And also it will start mixing in with those colors. Let's add a little around the edges. Try to leave some of those white spots visible, like this one here and this one. And just add a little bit of the gray. What I also like to do with this is I like to load my brush up with water and then with paint and then tap some of that light color in. Just tap it in. And again, look at how interesting it makes your galaxy. Now we are going to allow this to dry before we move on to the next step. You can use a heat gun such as this one that I have here, but remember this is canvas, so you want to keep the heat gun far away from your piece. Don't put it really close. We don't want to burn the canvas, so keep it far and keep it moving. Keep it moving at all times. Don't blast just one area. Keep it far and keep it moving. And let's do that now. One thing that you are going to notice when you're drying your canvas as opposed to when you're drying watercolor paper is that when you're drying watercolor paper, the watercolor, if the paper is not soaking wet like this is, the watercolor paper will allow the watercolor to stay put. With the canvas, all of the water is on the surface. So by using a heat gun, you're going to be able to manipulate some of that paint a bit. If you don't want that to happen, if you want to leave it as is, then I suggest you don't use a heat gun or a hair dryer. You just leave it as is to dry. However, I really love the way that it looks when it's moving about. So I'm going to give you a close-up of it so that you can see it happening. Now that our piece is dry, we are going to move on to a smaller brush. I've really abused this brush. I'm going to take a Pigeon Letters size 4 brush, and I'm going to go back in to my indigo that I was using earlier, and I am going to really try to be as precise as possible to get the edges of the canvas. So as I said before, if you weren't able to get the edges of the canvas, that is absolutely not a problem, because now is the time to work those edges. And the key here, like, you don't have to be precise on the back. Obviously, you know, it's a mess back there sometimes. Um, but try to be a little bit precise, especially for the front, so that it doesn't get into your piece. And we're going to turn it, and you're going to see what just happened to my piece. Because if you know anything about my tutorials, you know that if there is a mistake to be made, I will make that mistake and I will keep it in the video for you. So you're going to see here that this area here was not dry, and I stuck my finger in it. So now there's a nice little fingerprint in this area. So let's fix that. If you start working on your piece and it is not completely dry, you can just go back into the piece, and the thing with the canvas is if you add some water to it, it is going to remove some of that paint. So I'm going to go back to my original color, which was the Chesapeake gray, which was the light gray, and I am going to dab some of that color in. I'm going to dab, 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 and I'm using my darker color. I am also going to dab a bit of the indigo, and we're just going to add another layer. And this is also good to add another layer if you have a bit of separation between the edges and the top of your canvas. So I am not adding too much paint. I am mostly adding water. But if you want to make your piece a little darker at this stage, you actually can do that. So I am alternating between my first two brushes, the size 14 and the size 6. And I am going in and I am just very, very lightly adding a bit of water over the entire piece, just very, very lightly, because we don't want to move too much of that paint. Remember, this is canvas, it is not watercolor paper. So we're going to tap in some of the Chesapeake gray, which is our very first color. And I'm going to take advantage of this, and I am going to make the edges just a bit darker. So this is like adding a 5th layer? I think that's what we were up to, 5th or 6th layer. Unfortunately, with canvas, it's not as easy to correct as it is with watercolor paper. Because again, everything sort of stays surface level with a canvas. But it does take watercolor really, really well, especially if you get the cotton primed one. So I'm adding in a bit more, and now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to add in the droplets that I had before, and I am going to allow this to dry again. I think by giving it this final layer, it added a lot more interest. And I'm going to show you, it gave me a lot more of some of that separation and a lot more of the white spaces. There's a lot more depth to the darker spaces here. I really enjoyed that. Okay, so the next step that we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of white. Let's put our colors aside. And now we're going to take a little bit of white. So I use Copic Opaque white. You can feel free to use any white you have. White gouache, white watercolor, Dr. P.H. Martin's, white ink, any white you have will suffice for this. You're going to grab a smaller brush. In my case, it's my very well loved and well used size 4 Pigeon Letters brush. You want to load it with water, dip it in your white, and get a good amount of white on there. And you can either tap it in, or you can use a brush and tap it against the brush. And as you're tapping, make sure that you are going in different directions so that the splatter doesn't only hit in one direction. If you are going to tap it in, you will get much bigger splatter than if you use another brush. You'll get finer splatter with another brush. Now, don't be shy. Put as much splatter as you'd like. You know, alternate between the two if you would like. And yeah, go a little crazy with it. I'm gonna put a little bit more, and if you want bigger splatter, you use a bigger brush. So from the 4, we're gonna move to a size 6. If you want finer splatter, use a smaller brush. So here's my size 6 splatter, which is a lot bigger. The bigger the brush, the bigger the splatter. And then finally, I am going to move on to a liner brush. Okay, a liner brush has fine, long bristles. And with the same white, I'm going to dip it into my pot of white. One thing you have to be careful of when you're using a pot of white, such as Copic Opaque white or Dr. P.H. Martin's, is that you don't get a glob of paint or a glob of white on the tip of it, like this. If that happens, just swirl it against the inside to take it to a nice fine point. And on this, we are going to draw some stars. And we are going to make it very, very simple. I'm going to start with a cross, nice and thin, nice and thin. And since this brush is so thin, you will definitely need to reload quite a few times. Remember to keep the tip of the brush nice and fine. Okay, let's go down that one again. My hands have always been extremely shaky. So for all of my fellow shaky hands, you absolutely can do this. And now we're going to draw a really light X in the middle of it to make it look a little glowy. And I'm going to add a few of these. They're not all going to be that size. I like to add one big one and then a few small ones here and there. Sometimes I get carried away, and make the X inside there as light as you can possibly get it. And yeah, we're just going to add a few here and there. Make sure that you are wetting your brush in between so that the paint glides on smoothly. And let me add one right in this tiny area right here. Oh, that one is a little lopsided. That's okay. We are going to be okay with a little lopsided paint. Now I'm going to go back with to my size 6 brush, and I am going to add just a couple of dots. So I'm loading my brush up, and with the very tip of it, I am adding in some bigger dots of color or of white, and that is just to give it a little bit more interest. Try to scatter it around as much as you can. And we are done. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial, and these are ready to frame, ready to mount on a wall. These are just perfect for gift giving. Put it on a little tiny easel. I've always loved those. You can paint anything with them as long as you keep in mind that the water stays on top of the canvas and that the paint doesn't flow as well unless you actually manipulate the canvas. So you can use your imagination. The sky's the limit. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you all for the next one.